In a tense classroom at Westfield High School, Mia Johnson, a new student, faces blatant discrimination from her teacher, Miss Thompson. Dismissed and ignored during discussions, Mia not only remains silent but also demonstrates extraordinary inner strength. Will she be able to stand firm against these challenges? While her classmates are anxious and divided, a group discussion places Mia in the spotlight. With determination and resolve, she seeks not only to prove her perspective, but also to fight for justice and equality. But will Mia's courage be enough to confront a prejudiced teacher? This story is not merely about a student standing up against discrimination. It is a journey of discovering the power of resistance and the voice of the oppressed. What will happen when all the secrets are revealed? What mysterious character will emerge? Who will triumph in this silent battle? And what fate awaits them? And before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if this story of bravery resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The bell rang, heralding the start of yet another day at Westfield High. Miss Thompson stood at the front of her English class, her hawkish gaze sweeping across the students as they settled into their seats. The air was thick with unease, a familiar tension that always accompanied her lessons. As the last few stragglers shuffled in, a new face appeared in the doorway. Mia Johnson stepped into the room, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder. Her entrance drew mixed reactions from her classmates, some curious, others apprehensive. Miss Thompson's lips pressed into a thin line as she observed Mia make her way to an empty desk. "Well, well," Miss Thompson said, her voice laced with false sweetness. "It seems we have a new addition to our class. I do hope you can keep up with our challenging curriculum." The way she emphasized challenging made it clear she had her doubts. Mia met her gaze with a steady confidence, saying nothing as Miss Thompson turned her attention back to the board. The atmosphere in the room shifted, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The tension in the classroom was palpable. What happens when a teacher's bias collides with a student's quiet strength? Mia's next move could change everything. Miss Thompson cleared her throat, her eyes narrowing as they focused on Mia. Today we'll be discussing the themes of power and oppression in To Kill a Mockingbird. Who would like to start? Her gaze swept the room, pointedly avoiding Mia's raised hand. After calling on several other students, Miss Thompson finally acknowledged Mia with a stiff smile. "Yes, Miss Johnson. Do you have something to contribute?" Mia straightened in her seat, her voice steady. "I believe the novel shows how systemic racism affects individuals and society." "Systemic racism?" Miss Thompson interrupted, her tone dripping with condescension. "My dear, I think you're confusing this classic American novel with some modern political agenda." A ripple of discomfort passed through the classroom. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others smirked, eager for the drama to unfold. Mia took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk. "With all due respect, Miss Thompson, the racial injustices depicted in the book reflect real-world issues." "That's quite enough." Miss Thompson cut her off again, waving dismissively. "Perhaps you should focus on understanding the text as it's written rather than trying to impose your own interpretations." The air thickened with tension. Mia's jaw clenched, but her eyes remained locked on Miss Thompson's face. Though silent, her posture conveyed a quiet defiance that seemed to unsettle the teacher even more. Miss Thompson turned back to the whiteboard, her marker squeaking as she wrote. "Now, let's discuss the actual themes the author intended. Can anyone tell me about the symbolism of the mockingbird?" As the lesson continued, Miss Thompson pointedly ignored Mia's attempts to participate. Each time Mia raised her hand, the teacher's gaze would slide past her as if she were invisible. The message was clear. Mia's voice was not welcome in this classroom. Other students began to take notice. A few exchanged worried glances, their discomfort growing with each passing minute. while others, emboldened by Miss Thompson's behavior, threw sidelong smirks in Mia's direction. Frustration was evident in the set of Mia's shoulders and the tightness around her eyes, yet she remained composed, taking meticulous notes as an act of resistance, a refusal to be silenced or pushed out of her education. As the class neared its end, Miss Thompson announced a group project. "I'll be assigning the groups," she said. "We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place." The implications of her words hung heavily in the air. Mia's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the challenge for what it was. She squared her shoulders, meeting Miss Thompson's gaze with quiet determination. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, students began to file out. Mia took her time gathering her things, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Just as she reached the door, Miss Thompson called out, "Miss Johnson, a word." Mia turned, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Miss Thompson?" The teacher's smile was thin and sharp. "I hope you understand that in this class we focus on facts and analysis, not personal opinions or agendas. I'd hate to see you struggle because you can't separate your feelings from the curriculum." For a moment, Mia said nothing. Then, with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside her, she replied, "I understand perfectly, Miss Thompson. I look forward to demonstrating my analytical skills in our next discussion." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Miss Thompson staring after her, a flicker of uncertainty crossing the teacher's face. As the days passed, Miss Thompson's initial uncertainty hardened into cold resolve. She would show that girl exactly who was in charge, no matter the cost. The next class would reveal the depths of her prejudice and test Mia's strength like never before. The following week, Mia entered the classroom with her head held high, determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Miss Thompson stood at the front, her eyes narrowing as Mia took her seat. The air crackled with tension, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. As the lesson began, Miss Thompson's focus on Mia intensified. Every movement, every word became subject to scrutiny. "Johnson, is that gum I see you chewing?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Mia froze, her hand halfway to her mouth. She wasn't chewing gum at all. "No, Miss Thompson. Don't lie to me, young lady. Spit it out this instant." Miss Thompson's voice dripped with disdain. Mia's classmates shifted uncomfortably. Some averted their eyes, while others watched with morbid fascination. Mia stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She walked to the trash can, pantomiming the act of spitting out non-existent gum, and returned to her seat. The silence in the room was deafening. As the class progressed, Miss Thompson's behavior grew increasingly brazen. She nitpicked every aspect of Mia's participation, from her handwriting to her posture. "Sit up straight, Johnson. This isn't some casual hangout spot," she barked, ignoring the fact that Mia's posture was no different from her peers. Mia's frustration was evident in the tightness of her jaw and the way her fingers curled around her pen. She took deep breaths, struggling to maintain her composure as the onslaught continued. The class dynamics began to shift. Some students, like Sarah in the front row, shot sympathetic glances at Mia when Miss Thompson wasn't looking. Others, emboldened by the teacher's behavior, joined in with snickers and whispered comments. During a group discussion, Mia raised her hand to contribute. Miss Thompson's lips curved into a cold smile. "Yes, Miss Johnson, do enlighten us with your unique perspective." Mia's voice was steady as she began to speak, but Miss Thompson interrupted almost immediately. "I'm sorry, but could you please enunciate more clearly? We can't all understand certain dialects." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Mia's eyes widened, and her hands clenched into fists beneath her desk. The racism, once veiled, now stood naked and ugly before them all. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Miss Thompson called out, "Miss Johnson, please see me after class. We need to discuss your performance." Mia approached the teacher's desk, her heart pounding but her expression carefully neutral. Miss Thompson looked up, her eyes cold. "I hope you understand, Miss Johnson, that your attitude is becoming a problem. If you can't adapt to the standards of this class, perhaps you should consider finding a more suitable environment." The implications hung heavy in the air. Mia took a deep breath, her voice low but firm. "I understand perfectly, Miss Thompson. I'll continue to do my best, as I always have." As Mia turned to leave, Miss Thompson added, "Oh, and Miss Johnson, don't forget your group project presentation is due next week. I do hope you're prepared." Mia nodded, her mind racing. She knew the presentation would be a turning point. Miss Thompson would likely use it as an opportunity to humiliate her in front of the entire class. But Mia was determined not to give her that satisfaction. The air crackled with anticipation as Mia stepped up to deliver her presentation. Little did she know, Miss Thompson had been waiting for this moment to unleash her most brutal attack yet. What would happen when prejudice and power collided in front of the entire class? Mia took a deep breath, steadying herself as she faced her classmates. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, determined to prove herself despite Miss Thompson's constant belittling. The project board behind her displayed a meticulously researched analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing on the themes of racial injustice and moral courage. As Mia began her presentation, Miss Thompson's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a smirk. She watched like a predator waiting to pounce, her pen tapping impatiently against her grading sheet. The other students shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing the tension in the air. Halfway through her presentation, Mia paused to answer questions. Miss Thompson's hand shot up immediately. "Miss Johnson," she drawled, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I'm curious about your choice of focus. Don't you think you're overemphasizing certain aspects of the novel?" Mia's brow furrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I believe the racial themes are central to understanding the book's message." "I'm well aware of what the author said," Miss Thompson interrupted sharply, "but I'm more interested in why you seem unable to appreciate the broader literary merits beyond your personal biases." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Mia's hands clenched at her sides, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "I don't believe my analysis is biased, Miss Thompson. I've supported each point with textual evidence and scholarly sources." Miss Thompson stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor as she positioned herself between Mia and the rest of the class. "Let me make something clear, Miss Johnson. This constant focus on race is not only misguided, but also disruptive to the learning environment. Perhaps in your previous school, such narrow interpretations were acceptable, but here, we expect a higher level of academic rigor." The silence in the room was deafening. Some students stared at their desks, unable to meet Mia's eyes. Others watched with a mix of horror and morbid fascination as their teacher continued her tirade. "Furthermore," Miss Thompson pressed on, her voice rising, "your insistence on inserting modern political agendas into classic literature is not only inappropriate but also demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding. I'm beginning to wonder if you're truly capable of handling the curriculum at this level." Mia's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she refused to back down. "Miss Thompson, I respectfully disagree. The themes of racial injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird are as relevant today as they were when the book was written. Ignoring them does a disservice to the author's intent." "Enough," Miss Thompson snapped. "Your attitude is bordering on insubordination. I suggest you take your seat and reflect on whether you're truly prepared for the academic standards of this class." As Mia slowly gathered her materials, the weight of humiliation pressed down on her shoulders. A small voice piped up from the back of the room. "But I thought Mia's presentation was really good." Miss Thompson whirled around, her eyes flashing. "And what would you know about literary analysis, Mr. Taylor? Perhaps you'd like to join Miss Johnson in detention to discuss your own academic shortcomings." The student shrank back in his seat, effectively silenced. Miss Thompson turned back to Mia, who stood frozen by her desk. "Well, what are you waiting for? Sit down so we can move on to presentations actually worth our time." Mia sank into her chair, her face burning with a mixture of anger and shame. She could feel her classmates' eyes on her, some sympathetic, others cruelly amused. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to take slow, steady breaths as Miss Thompson called the next student to present. Mia's mind raced. She knew she couldn't let this continue, but what could she do? The teacher held all the power, and speaking out would only lead to more humiliation. For now, she would have to endure, but a quiet determination began to build within her. This wasn't over. As Mia sat in her seat, her thoughts raced with ideas of justice and retribution. Fate was about to deal an unexpected hand. The classroom door opened, and Miss Thompson looked up, a smug smile playing on her lips. "Class, I have an important announcement," she declared, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I've decided it's time for a parent-teacher conference regarding Miss Johnson's performance." Mia's heart raced, a mix of dread and defiance coursing through her veins. She knew her father would stand up for her, but the thought of him confronting Miss Thompson filled her with anxiety. The other students exchanged glances, some worried, others curious about what would happen next. Miss Thompson continued, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond her classroom walls. "I've requested a meeting with Miss Johnson's parents after school today. I'm sure they'll be very interested to hear about her disruptive behavior and subpar academic performance." As the words left Miss Thompson's mouth, footsteps echoed in the hallway, steady and purposeful, growing louder with each passing second. The entire class seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. There was a brief pause, pregnant with possibility, before a firm knock broke the silence. "Come in," Miss Thompson called out, her voice tinged with irritation. The door swung open, revealing a tall, distinguished-looking man in a crisp suit. His presence commanded attention, and a ripple of recognition passed through the students. It was Mr. Johnson, the school principal. Mia's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and relief washing over her face. She glanced at Miss Thompson, who remained blissfully unaware of the connection between the new arrival and her targeted student. Mr. Johnson stepped into the room, his eyes quickly scanning the faces before him. They lingered for a moment on Mia, a flicker of concern passing between them. Then he turned to Miss Thompson, his expression neutral but radiating authority. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Miss Thompson straightened, plastering on her most professional smile. "Not at all, Mr. Johnson. We were just wrapping up a lesson on To Kill a Mockingbird. Is there something I can help you with?" Mr. Johnson nodded, his eyes now fixed on the teacher. "Actually, there is. I understand you've requested a parent-teacher conference regarding one of your students." "Yes, that's correct. I believe it's crucial to address certain issues before they become more problematic." "I see. And which student might this be?" Mr. Johnson replied, his tone neutral. Miss Thompson turned, gesturing towards Mia with a dismissive wave. "Miss Johnson, actually no relation to you, of course. You see, Miss Johnson is African American, so I thought there was no way she could be related to you." She chuckled at her own joke, oblivious to the growing tension in the room. Mr. Johnson's eyebrow raised slightly, the only outward sign of his reaction. "Is that so? Well, Miss Thompson, I believe we should discuss this matter further, perhaps in private." Miss Thompson nodded eagerly, already imagining the support she would receive from the principal. "Of course, Mr. Johnson, I'd be happy to share my concerns about Ms. Johnson's performance and attitude." As Miss Thompson began gathering her materials, Mr. Johnson turned to address the class. "Students, please continue with your assigned reading. Will only be a moment." He then looked directly at Mia, a small reassuring smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was a subtle gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Mia sat up straighter, feeling a surge of confidence she hadn't experienced in weeks. Miss Thompson, still oblivious to the true nature of the situation, led the way out of the classroom. Mr. Johnson followed, pausing briefly at the door to cast one last glance at his daughter. The look they shared was one of understanding and shared strength. As the door closed behind them, a buzz of excited whispers filled the room. Students leaned across desks, speculating about what was about to unfold. Mia remained silent, her eyes fixed on the door, knowing that justice was finally about to be served. The closed door couldn't muffle the rising voices outside. Miss Thompson's confident tone gave way to stammering confusion as Mr. Johnson's calm filled the air. How would the teacher's attitude shift when she discovered Mia's true identity? Miss Thompson led the way to an empty conference room. her heels clicking against the tiled floor. She turned to face Mr. Johnson, a smug smile playing on her lips. "I appreciate you taking the time to discuss this matter, Mr. Johnson. I've been quite concerned about Mia's performance and attitude in my class." Mr. Johnson nodded, his expression neutral. "I see. Please tell me more about your concerns." Miss Thompson launched into her complaints, her voice growing more animated with each passing moment. "Well, for starters, she consistently challenges the curriculum. She insists on injecting her personal views into every discussion, derailing the lessons I've carefully prepared." As she spoke, Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He remained silent, allowing Miss Thompson to continue her tirade. "And her attitude," Miss Thompson exclaimed, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "She's constantly disrupting the class with her unique perspectives. Just today, she gave a presentation that completely missed the point of To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing solely on racial themes and ignoring the broader literary merits." Mr. Johnson raised an eyebrow. "And you believe this focus on racial themes is inappropriate for discussing a novel that centers around a charged trial?" Miss Thompson faltered for a moment, caught off guard by the question. "Well, I believe we should focus on the universal themes, not get bogged down in specific issues." "I see," Mr. Johnson said, his tone measured. "And how exactly has Mia been disruptive? Can you give me specific examples?" Miss Thompson straightened, regaining her confidence. "Of course. She constantly raises her hand to challenge points I make in class. She argues with other students during discussions, and her body language, the way she sits there, all defiant, it's clear she has no respect for authority." As Miss Thompson spoke, Mr. Johnson's expression shifted subtly. A hint of steel entered his eyes, though his voice remained calm. "Miss Thompson, I'd like to ask you something. Have you considered that what you perceive as defiance might actually be a student engaged in critical thinking?" Miss Thompson blinked, taken aback by the question. I suppose I hadn't thought of it that way. But Mr. Johnson, you have to understand, this girl is simply not a good fit for our school. Her previous education must have been lacking. Perhaps a different environment would be more suitable for her." Mr. Johnson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see. And what makes you think Mia's previous education was lacking?" "Well, it's obvious, isn't it?" Miss Thompson said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The way she speaks, her focus on certain issues, it's clear she hasn't been exposed to the level of rigor we expect here." Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Miss Thompson, I think it's time I clarified something for you. Mia's previous education was excellent. In fact, I can personally vouch for that." Miss Thompson frowned, confusion evident on her face. "I don't understand. How could you possibly know that?" Mr. Johnson's eyes locked onto Miss Thompson's, unwavering. "I know because I'm Mia's father." The color drained from Miss Thompson's face as the implications of Mr. Johnson's words sank in. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The smug confidence that had carried her through the conversation evaporated in an instant. "You're Mia's father?" she stammered, her eyes wide with shock and growing horror. Mr. Johnson nodded, his expression grave. "Yes, Miss Thompson. Mia Johnson is my daughter, and I've been listening very carefully to everything you said about her." Miss Thompson stumbled backward, gripping the edge of a nearby desk for support. The realization of what she had done, of the prejudices she had revealed to the principal, and more importantly to a father, crashed over her like a tidal wave. "Mr. Johnson, I had no idea," she managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clearly," Mr. Johnson replied, his tone carrying a weight that made Miss Thompson flinch. "But ignorance is no excuse for the behavior you've displayed. Not only have you demonstrated a clear bias against my daughter, but your comments suggest a pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student." Miss Thompson's mind raced, desperately searching for a way to salvage the situation. "Mr. Johnson, please, I can explain." "I never meant to." Johnson held up a hand, silencing her. "I think you've explained quite enough, Miss Thompson. We'll be having a much longer conversation about this. But for now, I suggest you return to your classroom. We wouldn't want to keep the students waiting, would we?" As Miss Thompson numbly nodded and turned to leave, Mr. Johnson added, "Oh, and Miss Thompson, I'll be sitting in on your class for the remainder of the day. I'm very interested in observing your teaching methods firsthand. Mr. Johnson's measured tone belied the storm brewing beneath as he stepped back into the classroom, followed by a visibly shaken Miss Thompson. The atmosphere shifted palpably. Students straightened in their seats, sensing the tension crackling between the two adults. "Class!" Mr. Johnson addressed the room, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I believe we need to have an important discussion about respect, diversity, and the true purpose of education." Thompson stood rigidly by her desk. Her earlier confidence evaporated. She glanced nervously at Mr. Johnson, then at Mia, her mind racing to process the revelation she had just experienced. Mr. Johnson continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "It has come to my attention that there have been some concerning incidents in this class. Incidents that go against everything our school stands for." A collective intake of breath rippled through the students. Some cast furtive glances at Mia, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "Miss Thompson, would you care to explain to the class why you felt it necessary to consistently undermine and belittle one of your students?" The teacher's mouth opened and closed, words failing her. "Miss Thompson," Mr. Johnson pressed, "never meant to what? Never meant to make racist assumptions about a student's background? Never meant to dismiss valid interpretations of literature because they didn't align with your narrow worldview?" The students watched in stunned silence as their usually mild-mannered principal transformed before their eyes. His words, precise and cutting, laid bare the injustices that had been simmering beneath the surface of their classroom for weeks. "Let me be clear," Mr. Johnson continued, his eyes locked on Miss Thompson. "Your behavior towards Mia, and I suspect towards other students of color, is not only unprofessional but deeply harmful. You've created an environment where students feel unsafe expressing their thoughts and experiences." Miss Thompson attempted to interject, her voice trembling. "Mr. Johnson, please, if I could just explain." "Explain what exactly?" Mr. Johnson cut her off, his patience wearing thin. "Explain how you mock Mia's analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird because it focused on racial themes. Explain how you've consistently ignored her raised hand in class discussions? Or perhaps you'd like to explain your comment about her previous education being lacking, simply because she doesn't conform to your preconceived notions?" The color drained from Miss Thompson's face as Mr. Johnson recounted her actions. She glanced around the room, seeking any sign of support, but found only shocked and disappointed faces staring back at her. "Students," Mr. Johnson said, turning to address the class once more, "I want you to understand something. Education is not about silencing voices or dismissing perspectives that challenge our own. It's about expanding our understanding, engaging in respectful dialogue, and learning from diverse experiences." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What you've witnessed in this classroom is not education. It's discrimination, plain and simple. And it stops today." The tension in the room was palpable. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement with Mr. Johnson's words. Mia sat quietly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of relief and vindication. Mr. Johnson's gaze returned to Miss Thompson, who seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. "Miss Thompson, your actions have demonstrated a clear pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student. This behavior is unacceptable and will be addressed through the proper channels. For now, I'll be taking over your class for the remainder of the day." As Miss Thompson gathered her things, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, the reality of the situation seemed to finally hit her. She cast one last desperate look around the classroom before hurrying out the door. The silence that followed her exit was deafening. Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, visibly calming himself before addressing the class once more. "I apologize that you've had to witness this, but I believe it's important for you to understand that prejudice and discrimination have no place in our school or in our society." He moved to the front of the classroom, his posture relaxing slightly. Some students looked shell-shocked, others appeared relieved. A few cast apologetic glances toward Mia, the weight of their silent complicity hanging heavily in the air. Mr. Johnson cleared his throat, regaining the class's attention. "I know this has been an intense and emotional experience for all of you. We'll be bringing in a counselor to help process what's happened here, For now, class is dismissed early. Please use this time to reflect on what you've witnessed and how we can all work together to create a more inclusive environment. As the students filed out, many paused to offer words of support to Mia. Sarah, who had always sat quietly in the front row, approached hesitantly. "I'm sorry I never spoke up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I was scared." "It won't happen again," Mia replied, a small smile of understanding on her face. "Thank you, Sarah. Speaking up is hard, but it's how we make things better." Outside the classroom, word spread quickly. Students gathered in small groups discussing what they had heard in hushed tones. As Mia emerged, flanked by her father, a hush fell over the hallway. Then slowly, a ripple of applause began. It started with just a few students and grew until it echoed through the corridor. Mia walked tall, her head held high. The fear and isolation she'd felt for weeks melted away, replaced by a sense of empowerment. Her classmates weren't just seeing her now, they were truly recognizing her strength and resilience. Meanwhile, in the administrative office, Miss Thompson faced the consequences of her actions. The school board convened for an emergency meeting, and within hours, a decision was reached. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Miss Thompson was escorted from the building by security, a cardboard box of personal items clutched to her chest. Students watched from windows and doorways as their former teacher walked to her car, her career in education effectively over. There was no satisfaction in the scene, only a somber recognition that actions have consequences. The next morning, as Mia approached the school, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. Students who had previously avoided her now offered friendly smiles and waves in the hallways. She overheard snippets of conversations about diversity workshops and plans for a cultural awareness club. As she entered her English classroom, now temporarily led by a substitute teacher, Mia was greeted by a sea of supportive faces. The tension that had permeated the room for weeks was gone, replaced by an air of openness and mutual respect. During lunch, Mia found herself surrounded by classmates eager to hear her thoughts on how to make the school more inclusive. Ideas flowed freely, from diversifying the curriculum to establishing mentorship programs for minority students. For the first time, Mia felt truly heard and valued. After school, as Mia walked out with her father, they passed by Miss Thompson's now empty parking spot. Mr. Johnson squeezed his daughter's shoulder gently. "You know, Mia, what happened here isn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It's a reminder that change is possible, but it takes courage to speak up and stand firm in the face of injustice." Mia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I just hope it makes a difference beyond today. There are so many others who face discrimination every day, in and out of school." The events at Westfield High exposed how prejudice can lurk even in educational settings. Miss Thompson's treatment of Mia revealed deep-seated biases that had gone unchecked for years. But Mia's courage in speaking up sparked a transformation. The school community rallied around her, creating a more inclusive environment. In the end, Mia's journey became a moving tale of strength and resilience. In her battle against discrimination, she not only defended her own voice, but also ignited hope in the hearts of her classmates. The tears and smiles in the classroom revealed a profound lesson. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply a quiet yet powerful whisper from the soul. Mia showed us that when we stand together for justice, the power of unity can break down any barrier. Her story reminds us that each individual plays a role in the fight for equality, and it is empathy that holds the key to unlocking the door to change. So as the light of justice begins to dawn, let us take action together, daring to dream of a world where every voice is heard and respected. Let Mia's story be an inspiration for all of us, affirming that no matter how small, our voices can create significant waves in life.